Lyra didn't know that the Alpha King was searching for his fated mate. She didn't know her scent would call to him across thousands of bodies pressed together in the royal march, and she certainly didn't know that when she tried to disappear into the crowd, she'd become the most visible person in the kingdom. All she knew was the desperate need to hide. The royal march stretched through the capital like a golden river, banners snapping in the autumn wind as the kingdom's most powerful wolves processed through the streets. Lyra pressed herself deeper into the mass of bodies, her borrowed servant's dress scratching against her skin as she fought to become invisible. Behind her, she could hear the heavy boots of her stepfamily's guards searching, their voices cutting through the celebration like knives. "Find her!" Elena's voice carried over the crowd, sharp with fury. "She cannot have gone far." Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs as she ducked lower, using the press of excited citizens to shield herself from view. 3 days. She'd managed to hide for 3 days since discovering her stepmother's plan to sell her to Lord Blackthorn, a man whose cruelty was legendary, even among nobles. The marriage contract was already signed, the dowry already paid. All that remained was dragging Lyra to the altar, not if she could help it. The crowd surged forward as horns announced the approach of the royal procession, and Lyra found herself pushed toward the front despite her efforts to retreat. Panic clawed at her throat, too visible, too exposed. She tried to push back, but the wall of people held her trapped against the silk rope barriers lining the parade route. That's when she smelled it. Pine and winter storms, leather and something wild that made her breath catch. The scent hit her like a physical force, setting something deep in her chest ablaze with golden warmth she'd never felt before. The horns grew louder, and then she saw him. The Alpha King rode at the head of the procession on a massive black stallion, his dark hair catching the sunlight like a crown more magnificent than the circlet of silver at his brow. Even from a distance, his presence commanded everything around him. He was larger than she'd expected, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of contained power that spoke of barely leashed strength. Lyra had seen him before, of course, glimpses during state ceremonies when her step-family dragged her along as their unpaid servant. But never like this. Never when that impossible scent was filling her lungs and making her dizzy with its intensity. She pressed her hands to her chest, trying to understand what was happening to her. Heat spread through her body like wildfire, and she felt an inexplicable pull toward the approaching riders, as if a golden thread connected her heart to something she couldn't see. The king's head turned. It was a small movement, barely noticeable among the pageantry, but Lyra felt it like thunder in her bones. His eyes swept the crowd, searching, and she knew with terrifying certainty that he was looking for something, someone, her. Impossible. She was nobody. The cast-off daughter of a minor noble house, raised as little better than a servant since her father's death. The Alpha King couldn't be looking for her, but his gaze kept moving, relentless and sure, cutting through the thousands of faces like he knew exactly where to find what he sought. Lyra tried to shrink back, but the golden thread in her chest pulled tighter, and she found herself unable to look away. Closer. He was getting closer, and that wild scent was stronger now, making her feel drunk and terrified and alive in a way that made no sense. The procession slowed, then stopped. The entire royal march came to a halt in the middle of the street as the Alpha King raised his hand. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't part of the ceremony. Nothing stopped the royal march. Lyra's breath caught as his head turned toward her section of the crowd, nostrils flaring slightly. His eyes, she realized, were the color of storm clouds shot through with silver, and they were moving with predatory focus along the rope line, looking, searching, hunting. The golden warmth in her chest blazed hotter, and she felt her knees go weak. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. She was nothing, nobody. A girl in borrowed clothes, fleeing an arranged marriage. his gaze locked with hers. The world stopped. Everything else fell away. The crowd, the noise, the fear that had driven her for days. There was only him, only those silver storm eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, only the golden thread that snapped taut between them with the force of destiny itself. Recognition blazed in his face, fierce and triumphant and possessive. He'd found what he was looking for. The crowd began to part around her without being asked, people stepping back instinctively as if they could sense the supernatural force crackling through the air. Lyra stood frozen, trapped between terror and something else she couldn't name, as the Alpha King dismounted his horse in one fluid motion. "Your Majesty," someone whispered nearby. He stopped for her. She tried to run then, finally breaking free of the strange paralysis that had held her, but her legs felt like water, and the golden pull in her chest was too strong. She managed exactly 3 steps before his voice cut through the air like a blade. "Bring her to me!" The words carried the absolute authority of an Alpha King who had never been disobeyed, and Lyra felt the last of her strength desert her as his guards moved through the crowd toward her. This was it. This was how her story ended, not dragged to Lord Blackthorn's altar, but claimed by something far more powerful and infinitely more dangerous, the Alpha King himself. As gentle hands reached for her, Lyra caught one last glimpse of Elena's horrified face in the crowd, and she realized with distant satisfaction that for once in her life her stepmother had no idea what to do. Whatever was happening here was so far beyond her petty schemes that she might as well have been a child playing with dolls. The guards reached her, their touch careful despite their strength, and Lyra felt the golden thread give one last decisive pull toward the man who stood waiting for her with the patience of stone and eyes like winter storms. She was about to discover just how much her life could change in a single moment. The palace corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, their marble walls gleaming with veins of gold that caught the light from crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen starlight overhead. Lyra's borrowed shoes whispered against polished floors that reflected her uncertain steps, each footfall echoing her growing panic. Everything here was too grand, too beautiful, too far removed from the servants' quarters and cramped attic rooms where she'd spent the last 10 years of her life. She didn't belong here. Every breath she took felt stolen. The guards had escorted her through a maze of hallways lined with portraits of ancient kings and queens, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress with aristocratic disdain. Now she stood alone in what they'd called the Rose Chamber, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that some faceless palace lady had insisted she put on. The dress fit perfectly, which somehow made everything worse. It was as if the palace itself was conspiring to transform her into someone she could never be, someone worthy of an Alpha King's attention. The door opened with barely a whisper, and Lyra's heart slammed against her ribs as he entered. Without the pageantry and distance of the royal march, the Alpha King was even more overwhelming. He filled the doorway completely, his presence making the spacious chamber feel suddenly intimate and small. That wild scent of pine and storms hit her again, and the golden warmth in her chest flared to life with uncomfortable intensity. "You tried to run," he said, and his voice was different than she'd expected. Gentler. There was amusement there, but not mockery, more like fond exasperation. Lyra lifted her chin, clinging to what remained of her pride. "Wouldn't you?" Something shifted in his expression, approval flickering across his features like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Yes," he said simply, "I would have." He moved into the room with the fluid grace of a predator, but stopped well short of her personal space. Close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his storm-grey eyes, far enough that she didn't feel trapped. The consideration in that distance made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lyra." The word came out smaller than she'd intended. "Lyra." He repeated it like he was tasting something precious. "I'm Caspian." She almost laughed at the absurdity of it, as if she didn't know who he was, as if the entire kingdom didn't know the name of the Alpha King who commanded the loyalty of every pack from the northern mountains to the southern seas. "Your Majesty," she corrected, sketching an awkward curtsy. "Caspian," he said again, firmer this time. "To you, always Caspian." The golden thread in her chest pulled tight, responding to something in his tone that made her feel dizzy. She pressed her hands together to stop their trembling. "Why am I here? You could have anyone. Any woman in the kingdom would fall at your feet for the chance to—" "I don't want anyone else," he interrupted, and the quiet certainty in his voice made her breath catch. "I want my mate." The word hit her like a physical blow. Mate. The one thing every wolf dreamed of and most never found. The supernatural bond that connected souls across time and space, stronger than pack loyalty, deeper than love. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I'm nobody. I'm the cast-off daughter of a minor house, raised as a servant by my step-family. You're the Alpha King. You can't—" "I can," he said simply, "because you're not nobody. You're everything." The words landed in the space between them with the weight of destiny, and Lyra felt something crack open in her chest. Not the golden warmth this time, but something rawer. Hope, maybe, or terror at the possibility of hope. He moved closer then, slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wanted. When she stayed frozen in place, he reached out and touched her cheek with fingers that were surprisingly gentle for their size. "I've been waiting for you for 33 years, he said softly. "I'd started to believe you didn't exist." Lyra's eyes filled with tears she didn't understand. "I don't know how to be what you need." "You don't have to know, you just have to be." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, catching a tear that had escaped. "Can you feel it, the bond between us?" She could. God, she could. It was like a golden rope stretching between their hearts, pulling tighter every time he spoke, every time he touched her. It defied everything she knew about how the world worked, but it was more real than the marble beneath her feet. "I'm afraid," she admitted. Something fierce and protective flashed in his eyes. "Of me?" "Of trusting you." The words came out in a rush. "I've learned that powerful men take what they want and discard it when they're done. I won't survive being discarded by you." He was quiet for a long moment, his hand still cupped against her cheek. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a sacred vow. "Then I'll prove you wrong. However long it takes, I'll prove that this is real, that you matter, that you're safe with me." Before she could respond, he stepped back and moved to a small table laden with food. "You're too thin," he said, his tone shifting to something that sounded almost stern. "When did you last eat a full meal?" The change of subject left her reeling. What? Sit." It wasn't quite a command, but there was enough alpha authority in his voice that her body obeyed before her mind could catch up. He began filling a plate with careful precision. Roasted meat, fresh bread, delicate pastries that probably cost more than she'd seen in months. "You don't have to serve me," she protested as he set the plate in front of her. "I want to." He poured wine into a crystal goblet, the deep red liquid catching the light like liquid rubies. "My mate should never go hungry, never want for anything." Mate. There was that word again, spoken with such casual certainty that it made her head spin. She picked at the food, hyper-aware of his presence as he settled into the chair across from her. Everything was delicious, richer and more flavourful than anything she'd tasted in years. "Tell me about your step-family," he said, after she'd managed several bites. Lyra's hand stilled on her fork. "Why?" "Because they're the reason you were running. Because understanding your past helps me understand you." His eyes never left her face. "And because I suspect they're going to be a problem." The understatement of that almost made her laugh, except there was nothing funny about Elena's fury or Victoria's jealous rage. "They've petitioned the court," she said quietly, "claiming I'm a runaway servant who stole from them." Caspian's expression went very still, and Lyra caught a glimpse of the predator that lived beneath his careful control. "Have you? Stolen?" She shook her head. "The dress I was wearing belonged to my mother. Everything else I owned they'd already taken." She met his eyes, needing him to understand. "I am what they say I am in most ways. I've been their unpaid servant since my father died. I sleep in the attic. I clean their house. I tend their horses. The only reason they want me back is because Lord Blackthorn is still willing to pay for a wife, even a reluctant one." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Blackthorn?" Caspian repeated, and there was something deadly in his voice. "You know him." "I know his reputation." Caspian's jaw was tight with controlled anger. "He's buried 3 wives already." The casual way he said it made Lyra's stomach turn. She'd known Blackthorn was cruel, but 3 wives dead. "Elena said it was a generous offer, that I should be grateful any man would have me." "Your stepmother," Caspian said, with carefully measured words, "is a fool." Something warm unfurled in Lyra's chest at the quiet fury in his defence of her. When was the last time anyone had been angry on her behalf? A soft knock interrupted them, and a palace guard entered with a formal bow. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but there's been a messenger from the Ashford house. They're requesting an audience regarding—" "No," Caspian said without looking away from Lyra. "Your Majesty, they claim—" "I don't care what they claim." His voice carried the kind of absolute authority that ended arguments before they began. "My answer is no. They have no business here and no claim on what's mine." Mine. The possessive word sent heat racing through Lyra's veins, and she felt the bond between them pulse with responding warmth. It should have terrified her, this immediate claiming, but instead it made her feel safe for the first time in years. The guard bowed again and retreated, leaving them alone with the weight of what Caspian had just declared. "They'll never touch you again," he said quietly, turning back to her. "I give you my word." Lyra believed him. More than that, she felt the truth of it settling into her bones like a benediction. For the first time since her father's death, she was truly protected. When he reached across the table and offered her his hand, she didn't flinch away. 3 days in the palace had become a strange rhythm of luxury and fear. Lyra found herself waking each morning in a bed softer than clouds, dressed in silks that cost more than most people earned in a year, but still expecting someone to tell her it had all been a mistake, that she needed to return to her attic room and resume scrubbing floors. The expectation never came. Instead, palace ladies fussed over her measurements for new gowns, tutors appeared to refresh her knowledge of court protocols, and the royal library opened its doors to her like a treasure vault she'd never dreamed of accessing. Caspian had given orders that she was to have whatever she wished, and the staff treated those orders like holy commandments. It was almost enough to make her believe she belonged here. Almost. That illusion shattered the moment the herald announced visitors to the morning court session. "Lady Eleanor Ashford and Miss Victoria Ashford requesting audience with His Majesty regarding family matters." Lyra felt the blood drain from her face as the great doors opened and her step-family entered the throne room in a rustle of expensive silk and barely contained fury. Elena wore her finest gown, midnight blue with silver threading, and Victoria beside her looked like a pale echo in cream and gold. They dressed to impress, to remind the court of their status and wealth, to make Lyra look like exactly what they'd always told her she was. Nothing. "Your Majesty," Elena said, sinking into a perfect curtsy that spoke of years of practice, "we come before you with heavy hearts regarding a family matter of great importance." Caspian sat on his throne like carved stone, his expression giving nothing away, but Lyra could feel the tension radiating from him through their bond. The golden thread between them pulled tight with his controlled anger. "Speak," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled court with the kind of quiet authority that made people lean forward to listen. Elena straightened, and when she spoke, her voice carried the perfect blend of sorrow and righteous indignation. "We've come for Lyra Ashford, Your Majesty. She is our ward, bound to our family by legal contract after her father's death. 3 days ago, she fled our protection, stealing family heirlooms and money meant for the household staff." The words hit Lyra like physical blows, each one designed to cut deeper than the last. Around the throne room, she could hear the whispers starting, nobles leaning toward each other with expressions of scandal and judgment. This was what Elena did best: twist truth into lies so skillfully that even the victims started to believe them. "Furthermore," Victoria added, her voice sweet as poisoned honey, "she is promised in marriage to Lord Blackthorne, a union that will benefit both our families and the realm. Her flight has caused great embarrassment and financial hardship." Lyra felt her knees go weak. Here, in front of the entire court, they were reducing her to exactly what she'd always been in their eyes: a runaway servant, a thief, a burden to be disposed of at the first opportunity. She could feel the eyes of every noble in the room on her, weighing her worth and finding her lacking. She was wearing a gown worth a fortune, standing beside the Alpha King's throne, but in that moment she felt like the scared girl in the attic again, believing every cruel word Eleanor had ever spoken to her. "I see," Caspian said, and his voice was soft as silk and twice as dangerous. "These are serious accusations." Elena's smile was triumphant. "Indeed, Your Majesty. We ask only for the return of our ward and the stolen property, so that we might repair the damage done and fulfil our obligations to Lord Blackthorne." Lyra's vision blurred. This was it. This was how it ended. Even an Alpha King couldn't ignore theft accusations, couldn't protect someone who'd supposedly stolen from their legal guardians. The fairy tale was over, and she was about to return to the nightmare she'd tried so desperately to escape. She took a step back, then another, her mind already racing toward the exits. If she could just reach the gardens, maybe she could run again. Maybe she could— "Lyra!" Caspian's voice cut through her panic like a blade. "Stay!" The command in his voice was absolute, alpha authority that her body obeyed, even as her mind screamed at her to flee. She froze in place, trembling with the effort of staying still when every instinct told her to run. "You're quite right, Lady Ashford," Caspian continued, still in that dangerously soft tone. "These are indeed serious accusations: theft, breach of contract, false identity." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the court. "Tell me, what proof do you have of these claims?" Elena's confidence flickered for just a moment. "Proof, Your Majesty." "Proof," Caspian repeated. "Surely you wouldn't make such serious accusations against my intended mate without evidence to support them?" The throne room erupted. Gasps echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Whispers became exclamations, and Lyra felt the shock ripple through the assembled nobles like a physical wave. His intended mate. He'd said it in front of everyone, made it official in a way that couldn't be taken back. Elena's face went white, then red, then white again. "Your Majesty, surely you've been deceived. Lyra is not of suitable birth for such an honour. She's what?" Caspian interrupted, and now there was nothing soft about his voice. It carried across the room like thunder, making several courtiers take involuntary steps backward. "Please, continue. I'm fascinated to hear how you would describe the woman the moon goddess herself has chosen as my mate." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish gasping for air. Even Victoria had gone pale beside her, finally understanding that they'd walked into a trap of their own making. "Perhaps," Caspian continued, rising from his throne with fluid grace, "we should discuss the real truth here. Lyra Ashford, daughter of Lord Marcus Ashford, whose family held lands and titles for 3 centuries before his untimely death. Lyra, whose inheritance you've been managing, and I use that term loosely, for the past 10 years. Lyra's breath caught. Her inheritance. She'd been too young when her father died to understand the legal complexities, had accepted Elena's explanation that there was nothing left after debts were paid. But the way Caspian spoke, with such certainty. "The Ashford estates," he continued, moving down the throne room steps with predatory purpose, "which have been generating significant income under your stewardship, income that should have been held in trust for the rightful heir." His eyes fixed on Elena with laser focus. "Tell me, Lady Ashford, where are those funds now?" Elena's composure cracked completely. "Your Majesty, the expenses of raising an orphaned child, the cost of her education and care—" "Education?" Caspian's voice could have frozen fire. "Care? You mean the attic room she slept in, the servant's duties she performed without pay, the marriage you arranged to a man known for murdering his wives?" Each word hit like a physical blow, and Eleanor actually stumbled backward. Around them, the court watched in rapt attention as their carefully constructed lies crumbled to dust. Lyra felt something breaking open in her chest, but this time it wasn't fear. It was fury. Pure, righteous anger at the years of lies, the stolen inheritance, the systematic destruction of her self-worth. They'd made her believe she was nothing, when all along she'd been the rightful heir to lands and titles they'd stolen from her. "You took everything," she said, and her voice carried clearly across the silent throne room. "My inheritance, my identity, my future. You made me believe I was worthless so I wouldn't question why I had nothing." Victoria finally found her voice. "That's not— We raised you, we fed you, You used me," Lyra cut her off, the words pouring out like water through a broken dam. "I cooked your meals, cleaned your house, tended your horses, and you told me I should be grateful for the privilege, and when you grew tired of pretending to care, you tried to sell me to a murderer." "Enough!" Caspian's voice cut through the emotional chaos like a sword. He'd reached the bottom of the dais now, and when he spoke, his words carried the absolute authority of a king pronouncing judgment. "Lady Eleanor Ashford, Miss Victoria Ashford, you stand accused of fraud, theft, and abuse of a legal ward. You have exactly 1 hour to gather your belongings and leave my kingdom." Elena's face went ashen. "Your Majesty, please, we can explain—" "If I see either of you within my borders after sunset," Caspian continued, as if she hadn't spoken, "you will be arrested and tried for your crimes. Your properties will be seized to repay what you've stolen. Your titles will be stripped. Your names will be forgotten." He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "Choose your next words very carefully." The threat hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Elena looked around the throne room desperately, seeking support that would never come. No one would risk the Alpha King's wrath to defend admitted thieves and abusers. "You haven't won," Elena hissed, her mask of civility finally slipping completely. "She's still nothing, still the unwanted bastard child who couldn't even keep her own father alive." The words hit their mark with surgical precision, finding every insecurity Lyra had ever harboured. For a moment, she felt herself shrinking back into the scared girl who'd believed every cruel word. Then Caspian moved. He was beside her in 2 strides, his hand cupping her face with infinite gentleness, even as fury blazed in his storm-grey eyes. "Look at me," he said quietly, and when she met his gaze, the golden bond between them flared to life with renewed strength. "You are not nothing. You are not unwanted. You are mine, and I am yours, and nothing they say can change that truth." He turned to face the court, his arms sliding around Lyra's waist in a gesture of clear claiming and protection. "Let me be absolutely clear," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the throne room. "Lady Lyra Ashford is my chosen mate, my future queen, and under my personal protection. Anyone who speaks against her speaks against me. Anyone who threatens her threatens the crown itself." The formal claiming sent another wave of shock through the assembled nobles, but this time it was accompanied by something else. Respect. Acceptance. The recognition that this wasn't a temporary fancy, but a permanent reality they would all need to accept. Elena and Victoria stood frozen in the centre of the throne room, their elaborate gowns suddenly looking like costumes they'd borrowed for a play that had ended badly. All their schemes, all their careful plans, reduced to nothing by the simple truth of a supernatural bond they could never understand or challenge. "Your hour begins now," Caspian said without looking at them. "I suggest you use it wisely." As the guards moved to escort them out, Elena shot one last venomous look over her shoulder. "This isn't over," she mouthed, but her words carried no weight. Empty threats from a woman who'd already lost everything. Lyra watched them go with a mixture of satisfaction and lingering fear. 10 years of their cruelty didn't disappear in a single moment, no matter how public or complete their defeat. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't facing their malice alone. "Are you all right?" Caspian asked quietly, his thumb brushing across her cheek. Lyra leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his steady presence and the golden warmth of their bond. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm starting to be." When he kissed her then, soft and claiming and full of promise, she didn't pull away. Around them, the court erupted in applause, but all Lyra could hear was the thundering of her own heart and the whispered truth that she was finally, truly safe. The girl who'd believed herself nothing had discovered she was everything, and she was just beginning to understand what that meant. The engagement announcement sent shockwaves through the kingdom, like ripples across a still pond. Within hours, ravens carried the news to every packed territory, every noble house, every corner of the realm where wolves gathered to hear tales of their Alpha King's unprecedented choice. The servant girl who'd become a queen. The nobody who'd captured the heart of the most powerful Alpha alive. Lyra tried not to think about the whispers that surely followed in those ravens' wake. Instead, she focused on the overwhelming preparations that had consumed the palace. The claiming ceremony was to take place in 3 days, an ancient ritual that would bind them before pack and kingdom, making their bond official in the eyes of both wolves and the moon goddess herself. Palace ladies fluttered around her like anxious birds, fitting her for a gown that seemed to require more fabric than most people saw in a lifetime. "The ancestral crown jewels, my lady," the head seamstress murmured reverently, producing a circlet of silver and moonstone that made Lyra's breath catch. "Worn by every Alpha Queen for 500 years. Lyra stared at her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman looking back. The gown was midnight blue silk that seemed to capture starlight in its folds, cut to emphasize her newly revealed noble bearing. The circlet rested on her dark hair like it had been made for her, and for a moment she almost believed she looked like someone worthy of standing beside an Alpha King. Then reality crashed back, and she remembered that somewhere out there Eleanor and Victoria were planning their revenge. They hadn't gone quietly into exile as Caspian had commanded. Reports trickled in of their movements, seeking allies among nobles who disapproved of the match, spreading poison about Lyra's fitness to be queen, stirring up old grievances against the throne. But more concerning were the whispered rumours of gold-changing hands in taverns where rogues and sellswords gathered. Desperate people did desperate things, and Elena Ashford had nothing left to lose. "My lady?" The seamstress was looking at her with concern. "Are you quite well?" Lyra forced a smile. "Just nervous. It's a big day." The understatement of the century, but it seemed to satisfy the woman, who bustled away to make final adjustments. Lyra was left alone with her reflection and the growing certainty that something was about to go very, very wrong. The claiming ceremony began at sunset, when the moon's power was strongest and the ancient magic that bound mates could flow most freely. The grand throne room had been transformed into something out of legend. Silver banners hanging from the vaulted ceiling, moonstone crystals casting ethereal light, and hundreds of candles creating an atmosphere of sacred reverence. Every important noble in the kingdom was present, along with the alpha leaders of the 12 major packs. They filled the throne room from wall to wall, a sea of silk and velvet, and barely contained supernatural power. Lyra had never seen so many powerful wolves in one place, and the energy in the air was almost overwhelming. She stood at the back of the room, waiting for her cue to enter, when she caught a scent that made her blood run cold. Something wrong, something that didn't belong among the carefully vetted nobles and pack leaders, rogues, here in the heart of the palace. Before she could raise an alarm, the great doors opened, and she was announced to the assembly. There was no turning back now. She walked down the centre aisle on trembling legs, hyper-aware of every eye following her progress, every whispered comment about her appearance or worthiness. Caspian waited for her at the far end, standing before an altar carved with ancient wolf symbols and crowned with silver moonstone. He was magnificent in formal ceremonial garb, a crown of silver and obsidian, robes of midnight black that made his storm-grey eyes seem to glow with internal light. When he saw her approaching, something fierce and possessive blazed across his features. "Mine," his expression said, "forever mine." The golden thread between them sang with responding warmth, and for a moment Lyra forgot about rogues and revenge and everything except the impossible fact that this incredible man was about to bind himself to her for eternity. She reached the altar and placed her hand in his, feeling the familiar spark of electricity that jumped between them whenever they touched. The ceremonial words began, spoken in the old tongue by the pack's eldest shaman, ancient promises of loyalty, protection, and unbreakable bond. "By blood and bond," Caspian said, his voice carrying across the silent throne room, "by moon and magic, I claim this woman as my mate, my queen, my everything." His eyes never left hers as he spoke the ritual words that would tie their souls together for all eternity. "What the moon goddess has joined, no force on earth can separate." Lyra felt the magic settling into her bones like golden honey, warm and right and perfect. This was what she'd been born for. This moment, this man, this incredible sense of completion that made her feel whole for the first time in her life. "I accept," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the reverent silence. "By blood and bond, by moon and magic, I choose you. I choose this. I choose to stay." The words had barely left her lips when the attack came. They burst through the great doors like a nightmare given form, a dozen rogues in stolen guard uniforms, moving with the deadly purpose of wolves who'd been promised gold for murder. At their head was a man Lyra recognised with sick terror, Marcus Draven, Elena's cousin, and a wolf known for taking any contract that paid well enough. The assembly erupted into chaos as nobles screamed and scrambled for cover, but the rogues had eyes only for their target. They cut through the crowd with savage efficiency, heading straight for the altar where Lyra stood frozen in shock. "Kill the pretender!" Draven roared, his blade gleaming as he raised it toward her heart. "End this mockery before it can be completed." Time slowed to crystalline clarity. Lyra saw the blade descending, saw death reaching for her in the moment of her greatest triumph, saw her fairy tale ending in blood and screaming and Elena's final victory. Then Caspian moved. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment he was a man in ceremonial robes, the next he was something far more primal and deadly. His eyes blazed gold within a fire, his human form blurring at the edges as alpha power flooded through him like a supernatural storm. He was between Lyra and the rogues before her next heartbeat, moving with speed that defied physics. His hand closed around Draven's throat with crushing force, lifting the assassin off his feet as easily as a child might lift a doll. "You dare," he snarled, and his voice was no longer entirely human. It carried the undertones of something wild and ancient, something that had ruled forests and mountains when the world was young. "You dare threaten my mate?" Draven's blade fell from nerveless fingers as Caspian's grip tightened. Around them, the other rogues hesitated for a fatal instant, suddenly understanding exactly what they'd walked into. This wasn't just an alpha king protecting his chosen queen. This was a mated wolf defending the other half of his soul. The slaughter was brief and absolute. Caspian cut through the assassins like a force of nature unleashed, his movements too fast to follow, his strikes precisely lethal. He didn't roar or posture or waste energy on dramatics. He simply ended them, one by one, with the cold efficiency of a predator protecting his den. When it was over, when the last rogue lay still on the marble floor, an eerie silence fell over the throne room. Caspian stood amid the carnage, his ceremonial robes torn and bloodied, but his posture utterly controlled. The golden fire was already fading from his eyes, leaving only storm-grey determination and barely leashed fury. He turned to the assembled nobles, many of whom were pressed against the walls in terror, and when he spoke, his voice carried absolute, unquestionable authority. "Let this be understood by all," he said, the words echoing off the vaulted ceiling like a pronouncement of divine law. "Lady Lyra Ashford is my mate, my queen, and under my protection. Anyone who threatens her threatens the crown itself. Anyone who raises a hand against her will answer to me personally." His gaze swept across the crowd, marking faces, cataloguing reactions, ensuring that his message was received and understood. The ceremony will continue. It was a statement, not a suggestion. The pack shaman, who had pressed himself against the altar during the attack, straightened his robes with shaking hands and resumed the ritual as if nothing had happened, as if a dozen men hadn't just died violent deaths mere feet away, but something had changed in the sacred space between Lyra and Caspian. The bond that had been forming during the ceremony snapped fully into place with the force of their shared survival, completing itself with power that made the very air around them shimmer with golden light. She felt it settling into her soul like the final piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve her entire life. Complete, whole, his. When the shaman spoke the final words and declared them eternally bonded, Caspian cupped her face in hands that still trembled slightly with residual fury and kissed her with a desperate intensity that spoke of death faced and overcome together. The assembled nobles erupted in applause, partly from genuine celebration and partly from relief that they'd survived to witness history. But Lyra heard none of it. All she could focus on was the man holding her like she was the most precious thing in existence, the golden bond humming between them with perfect contentment, and the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. "Are you hurt?" he murmured against her lips, his hands running over her frame as if checking for wounds. "No," she whispered back, "but Elena, she'll try again. She won't stop until—" "She'll stop," Caspian said, and there was something final in his voice that made her shiver. "After tonight, she'll have no choice but to stop." Around them, guards were already moving to clean up the aftermath, removing the bodies and restoring order with practiced efficiency. This was not, Lyra realised with dawning understanding, the first time someone had tried to kill a member of the royal family. It was simply the first time they'd tried to kill her. "I choose you," she said again, louder this time, letting the words carry across the throne room for everyone to hear. "I choose this life, this bond, this future. Whatever comes next, we face it together." His smile was brilliant enough to outshine the moon itself. "Together," he agreed, and sealed the promise with another kiss that tasted of forever and felt like coming home. The claiming was complete. The bond was sealed. And Lyra finally understood that sometimes the greatest fairy tales began not with rescue, but with choosing to stop running and stand your ground beside someone worth fighting for. The months that followed were a revelation. Lyra had expected the transition to queenship to be overwhelming, a constant struggle to prove herself worthy of a crown she'd never been trained to wear. Instead, she found herself settling into the role with surprising grace, as if some part of her had always known this was where she belonged. Perhaps it was the bond that made everything feel possible. The golden thread that connected her heart to Caspian's had grown stronger since their claiming, weaving itself through every aspect of their shared life until she couldn't imagine existing without its constant warmth. When palace duties threatened to overwhelm her, she could feel his steady presence anchoring her. When nightmares of Elena's cruelty surfaced in the dark hours before dawn, his arms around her chased away every shadow. Healing, she discovered, was not a destination but a journey, one that was infinitely easier when you weren't walking it alone. "Your Majesty," Lady Margaretta said, appearing in the doorway of the morning room with a stack of correspondence that looked decidedly ominous. "The petitions for this week's court session have arrived." Lyra smiled at the older woman who had become her closest adviser and, surprisingly, something approaching a friend. "How many requests for audiences this time?" 43, Margarita replied, with the long-suffering tone of someone who'd been managing royal schedules for decades. "Including 6 marriage proposals for your hypothetical future daughters, 12 requests for pardons, and 1 rather creative offer to name a prize bull in your honour." "I'm flattered," Lyra laughed, accepting the stack of papers. "The bull sounds charming." 3 months ago, she would have been paralysed by the responsibility of making decisions that affected so many lives. Now she found herself looking forward to the morning court sessions, to the opportunity to help solve problems and ease suffering where she could. It was amazing what happened when you stopped believing you were worthless. She'd thrown herself into the aspects of queenship that resonated most deeply, championing causes for orphaned children, establishing shelters for families displaced by rogue attacks, creating programs to help young wolves from minor houses find their place in society. Every initiative felt personal, born from her own experience of being cast aside and forgotten. "There's also this," Margarita added quietly, producing a separate letter sealed with black wax. "From the Northern Territories, about the Ashford matter." Lyra's good mood dimmed slightly. Elena and Victoria had been tracked to the borderlands, where they'd attempted to ally themselves with a disgraced pack leader who harboured old grievances against the crown. The alliance had ended poorly. Apparently Eleanor's talent for manipulation had limits when applied to wolves who valued strength over silver tongues. "What happened?" Lyra asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. "They're dead," Margaretta said simply, "killed by the very rogues they hired to attack the claiming ceremony. It seems they refused to pay the agreed-upon price after the mission failed." Lyra stared at the letter for a long moment, waiting to feel something. Relief, perhaps, or satisfaction that justice had finally been served. Instead, she felt only a hollow sort of sadness for the women who'd wasted their lives on hatred and greed. "I see," she said finally. "Are there any other family members who might—" "None with legitimate claims to the Ashford estates," Margaretta assured her. "The properties and remaining funds will be officially restored to you by the end of the week." The irony was not lost on her. The inheritance Elena had spent 10 years stealing was finally returning to its rightful owner, just in time for Lyra to not need it anymore. She was queen now, with resources beyond imagining at her disposal. The money felt less like vindication and more like a footnote to a story that had already reached its conclusion. Use it for the orphanage expansion, she decided, and the new shelters. Let something good come of all that misery. Margarita's smile was warm with approval. "An excellent choice, Your Majesty." The morning court session proceeded smoothly, a mixture of routine administrative matters and more complex cases that required careful consideration. Lyra found herself particularly engaged with a dispute between 2 farming communities over water rights, the kind of problem that could escalate into violence if not handled with wisdom and fairness. She was deep in discussion with the village representatives when she felt it, the familiar flutter of warmth through their bond that meant Caspian was nearby. A moment later he appeared in the doorway of the throne room, and her heart did the same ridiculous skip it had been doing for months now. He was magnificent as always, but there was something different in his expression today. a particular kind of intensity that made the golden thread between them hum with anticipation. "Your Majesty," he said formally, though his eyes danced with private amusement. "When you have a moment, there's something I'd like to discuss with you." The farming representatives were quickly ushered out with promises that their case would be resolved by week's end, and then they were alone in the vast throne room. Caspian moved toward her with that fluid, predatory grace that still made her pulse quicken, stopping just close enough that she could catch his scent of pine and winter storms. "You've been busy today," he observed, nodding toward the stack of resolve petitions. "The bull naming was particularly complex," she replied solemnly. There were strong opinions about whether Lyra's champion or Queen's Pride would be more appropriate. His laugh was rich and warm, the sound she'd grown to love above all others. "And your decision?" "I suggested Caspian's Nightmare, in honour of your well-documented fear of large farm animals." "I am not afraid of cows," he protested with mock dignity. "I simply prefer my adversaries to have opposable thumbs." It was domestic banter, the kind of easy intimacy that had grown between them over months of shared meals and quiet evenings, and learning to trust completely in each other's presence. Lyra had never known that love could be so comfortable, so natural, like breathing or the beating of her own heart. "What did you want to discuss?" she asked, though the way he was looking at her made her suspect she already knew. Instead of answering immediately, he moved closer, his hands settling on her waist with the familiar possessiveness that never failed to send heat racing through her veins. "Do you remember our wedding night?" he murmured against her ear. "When you asked me what I wanted most in the world?" Lyra's breath caught. She remembered that conversation vividly, the way he'd looked at her with such tender intensity, the quiet admission that had made her heart clench with overwhelming love. "You said you wanted to see our children playing in the palace gardens," she whispered. "I did." His hands moved to rest over her still flat stomach, and the gesture was so gentle, so reverent, that it brought tears to her eyes. How would you feel about making that dream a reality sooner than expected? The implications hit her like a physical blow. "Are you saying—" "The healer confirmed it this morning," he said softly. "Our bond has created new life, love. You're carrying our child." Lyra felt her knees go weak with the magnitude of it. A baby. Their baby. The physical manifestation of the love that had transformed both their lives, growing safely beneath her heart. "How do you feel about it?" Caspian asked, and she could hear the barely controlled excitement in his voice, tempered by concern for her reaction. "Terrified," she admitted honestly, "and thrilled, and completely overwhelmed, and so happy I can barely breathe." His smile was radiant, transforming his entire face with pure joy. "Then we're in perfect agreement." He kissed her then, soft and claiming and full of promise for the future they were building together. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Lyra rested her forehead against his and marvelled at how much her life had changed. A year ago, she'd been nothing, a servant girl sleeping in an attic, believing herself worthless and unwanted, existing from one day to the next without hope or purpose. Now she was queen, beloved of the most powerful alpha in the realm, carrying his child and ruling at his side with wisdom that surprised even herself. She had purpose, direction, and the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. "I used to think love was weakness," she murmured, her hands coming up to frame his face. "Something that made people vulnerable to being hurt." "And now?" he asked. "Now I know it's the strongest force in the realm. It transformed me from someone who ran from everything into someone willing to stand and fight for what matters." Caspian's eyes grew soft with an emotion too deep for words. "You saved me too, you know. I was just existing before you came along, going through the motions of ruling without any real joy in it. Now I'm living, really living, for the first time in my life." That evening they walked through the palace gardens as they had countless times before, but everything felt different now. charged with new possibility, bright with dreams of the future. Lyra could almost see their children playing among the roses, hear their laughter echoing off the marble fountains. "When did you stop being afraid?" Caspian asked, as they paused beside the fountain where he'd first kissed her all those months ago. Lyra considered the question seriously. When had the constant undercurrent of fear finally faded? When had she stopped waiting for disaster to strike, for someone to tell her it had all been a mistake? "I didn't," she said finally. "I just stopped letting fear choose for me. I chose you instead. I chose love. I chose to trust that sometimes the impossible really does happen." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her with the same protective possessiveness that had drawn her to him from the very beginning. "I love you," he said simply, "more than kingdoms, more than power, more than anything I thought mattered before I found you." "I love you too," she replied, and meant it with every fibre of her being, forever and always, and in whatever comes after. Above them the moon shone down with silver approval, blessing their happiness with gentle light. In the distance, wolves howled their ancient songs to the night, and Lyra understood that she was part of something larger now, part of a pack, a kingdom, a legacy that would extend far beyond her own mortal life. She was no longer the girl who hid behind crowds, hoping to disappear. She was the queen who stood in moonlight, ready to face whatever the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that she would never face it alone. The fairy tale was complete, but the real story, the one about building a life worth living, was just beginning. 2 years later. The royal march proceeded through the capital with all the pageantry and splendour that tradition demanded, but this time Lyra rode beside Caspian rather than hiding in the crowd. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that complemented the silver circlet on her brow, and her hand rested protectively over the gentle swell of her belly, where their second child grew safe and warm. The kingdom had prospered under their joint rule. New laws protected the vulnerable, orphanages flourished in every major city, and the shelters Lyra had established had become models copied by neighbouring realms. What had begun as one woman's determination to ensure no child suffered as she had suffered had transformed into a legacy that would outlast them both. But today, as the procession moved through streets lined with cheering citizens, Lyra found herself scanning the crowd with different eyes than those who watched for threats or political manoeuvring. She was looking for the lost ones, the forgotten ones, the children who might be hiding in plain sight while hoping desperately to remain invisible. That's when she saw her, a girl of perhaps 10 years, pressed against the wall of a bakery with the desperate stillness of someone trying very hard not to be noticed. Her clothes were clean but patched, her dark hair hastily braided, and her wide eyes held the particular wariness that came from learning too young that the world was not always safe for small, powerless things. Lyra's heart clenched with immediate recognition. She'd worn that same expression once, felt that same desperate need to disappear. The girl was running from something, hiding from someone, and the sight of her triggered every protective instinct Lyra had developed, both as a queen and as a mother. "Stop," she said quietly, and Caspian responded immediately, raising his hand to halt the entire procession. The crowd murmured with confusion as the royal couple dismounted, but Lyra paid them no attention. She moved through the press of people with purposeful grace, her eyes never leaving the frightened girl who had begun to tremble as she realized she'd been spotted. "Hello," Lyra said softly when she reached the bakery wall. "What's your name?" The girl's chin came up with a defiance that was heartbreakingly familiar. "I haven't done anything wrong." "I know you haven't," Lyra replied, crouching down to bring herself to the child's eye level. "I wasn't suggesting you had. I simply thought you looked like someone who might need help." Something flickered in the girl's eyes. Hope, maybe, or the dangerous desire to trust. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "Because once upon a time I was exactly where you are now," Lyra said honestly. "Afraid, alone, and certain that no one in the world cared whether I lived or died. Someone helped me when I needed it most. Now I'd like to help you." The girl stared at her for a long moment, taking in the fine clothes and the crown, and the obvious wealth that surrounded the queen. "You were never like me," she said finally. "You're important. You belong somewhere." Lyra's smile was gentle and sad and infinitely understanding. "I was a servant in my stepfamily's house, sleeping in an attic and believing myself worthless. I wore borrowed clothes and thought I was nothing more than an unwanted burden. I know exactly what it feels like to be invisible, sweetheart, to believe that you don't matter." The defiance wavered, revealing the frightened child underneath. "My uncle says he owns me now that my parents are dead. Says I have to earn my keep, or he'll sell me to someone who will find a use for me. But I can't. I won't let him." "He doesn't own you," Lyra interrupted firmly. "No one owns you. You belong to yourself, and you have value beyond anything anyone could buy or sell." Behind her, she could feel Caspian's presence, solid and supportive, ready to follow her lead in whatever decision she made. The bond between them hummed with shared understanding. He'd seen exactly what she'd seen in this frightened girl, recognised the echo of the woman he'd first encountered, hiding in a crowd much like this one. "Would you like to come with us?" Lyra asked gently. "We have a palace full of people who understand what it's like to be alone, and we've found that the best way to heal from being unwanted is to surround yourself with people who choose to want you." The girl's eyes filled with tears she was trying desperately not to shed. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I don't know how to belong somewhere?" "Then you'll learn," Lyra said simply. "Just like I did, just like everyone does when they finally find their place in the world." She extended her hand, palm up, waiting patiently for the girl to make her choice. It was exactly the same gesture Caspian had made to her in those early days, an offer without pressure, an invitation that could be accepted or declined without consequence. After what felt like an eternity, small fingers crept into hers, trusting despite every instinct that probably screamed against it. "My name is Rose," the girl whispered. "Rose," Lyra repeated, tasting the sweetness of the name. "That's perfect. Roses are my favourite flowers, beautiful and strong, with thorns to protect themselves when necessary." The crowd watched in reverent silence as their queen lifted the child into her arms and carried her back to the royal carriage. This was why they loved her, Lyra realised with distant surprise. Not because she was perfectly polished or regally distant, but because she remembered what it felt like to need rescuing and made sure no one else had to face that darkness alone. That evening, as Rose was settled into guest quarters with a pile of books and more food than she'd probably seen in weeks, Lyra found herself on the palace balcony with Caspian, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. "You realise what you've done, don't you?" he asked, his arms circling her from behind as their twins played in the gardens below under the watchful eye of their guards. "Saved a child who needed saving," Lyra replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Started another revolution," he corrected, with fond amusement. "By tomorrow morning, every noble family in the kingdom will be asking themselves what they can do to help the forgotten children in their territories. You've made compassion fashionable." Lyra smiled, thinking of all the children who might benefit from that particular trend. "Good. The world has enough cruelty in it. There's no reason we can't tip the balance toward kindness instead." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their children play with the innocent joy that had been stolen from both their parents in different ways. Marcus, their eldest, had Caspian's dark hair and storm-grey eyes, while little Elena, named not for her grandmother but reclaimed from that legacy, was golden-haired and fierce with her mother's determination. "I spent years believing I was worthless," Lyra said quietly. "You didn't just love me, you taught me how to love myself, how to see value where I'd only seen failure." Caspian's arms tightened around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. "You did the same for me. I was just going through the motions before you, ruling without purpose. You gave me something worth protecting, worth building toward." "We make a good team," she observed. "The best," he agreed. "Every choice, every moment, every year that led me to that royal march where I found you hiding in the crowd, I'd live it all again for this, for you, for them, for the life we've built together." Lyra turned in his arms, studying the face that had become as familiar and necessary to her as her own heartbeat. "We don't have to," she said softly. "We have forever now." His kiss was tender and claiming and full of all the promises they'd kept to each other over the years. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Lyra marvelled once more at the impossible journey that had brought them here. From a girl hiding behind crowds to a queen who stopped kingdoms to help lost children. From believing herself nothing to understanding she was everything that mattered. From running from love to standing still and choosing it every single day with the man who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. The fairy tale was long complete, but the real story, the one about choosing love over fear, about building something beautiful from broken pieces, about creating a legacy of kindness in a world that needed more of it, that story would continue for as long as they drew breath. Below them, their children's laughter echoed through the garden, and in the distance, wolves sang their ancient songs to the rising moon. Rose's voice joined the chorus from her new room, tentative but growing stronger as she began to learn what it felt like to be safe. Lyra smiled and settled more deeply into her husband's embrace, surrounded by the family they'd created and the kingdom they'd transformed together. Sometimes the greatest magic wasn't supernatural bonds or destiny written in the stars. Sometimes it was simply the courage to stop running and choose love instead. Where are you listening from tonight? I love hearing your thoughts and knowing these stories reach people who understand the magic of believing in second chances and happy endings. If you'd like to support me and help more people discover these love stories, please subscribe. It's free and it helps these tales of hope and healing find those who need them most. Until next time, may you always remember that you are worth choosing, worth fighting for, and worth the kind of love that changes everything.